It was called the Bloodless Conquests. Nazi Germany took over countries, and they started falling like dominoes without even spilling any blood. Among them, Rhineland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, and even parts of Lithuania were all won over by the Nazis without much of a whimper from these nations or even from their leaders. Really interesting time period in European history. And we all came away asking, how is it possible that an evil dictator, Adolf Hitler, could take over in the fashion that he was doing it, without anybody throwing their arms up, without anybody blowing a whistle or calling a foul? The leaders seemed to be either passive in these other countries, fearful, maybe even ignorant. One of Hitler's most famous quotes from Mein Kampf is, "Thank God for leaders who don't think for themselves." Enter the Munich Agreement of 1938. The leaders of the neighboring countries to Nazi Germany, to Germany at that time, met together to talk to Hitler. The British Prime Minister was there. French leaders were there. They met in Munich, Germany in 1938 to discuss what was going on. Britain's Prime Minister at the time was a guy by the name of Neville Chamberlain. And Chamberlain came out of the Munich Agreement by saying this. He said, "Hitler is a great guy to be in power because it means peace at our time for our nation, Britain." And then on top of that, he also bragged that they were able to take Czechoslovakia peacefully, and that the British Prime Minister actually had a part in doing that. Chamberlain was what we would call, what we've been calling, a soft, warm, and fuzzy leader. Everything looked peaceful and looked good on the outside, and in reality, there was huge issues on the inside. He wasn't interested in making peace. He was interested in keeping the peace. And it wasn't long after the Munich Agreement of 1938 that the Pact of Steel was signed between the evil dictator in Germany, Adolf Hitler, and the evil dictator in Italy, Mussolini. And Mussolini and Hitler invaded Poland, and then all of a sudden now we had World War II on our hands. This morning, we are continuing in a sermon series that we have called The Divine Sawmill, how God uses imperfect leaders to achieve his very perfect will. And just like we saw during World War II with Nazi Germany, in Judges 4 and 5 this morning, there was a crisis in Israel. And it was a crisis of leadership. They were asking the same things of themselves in Israel that all of the world was asking during World War II of the Nazis. Where were all the courageous leaders? Where were the guys stepping up to do what they knew was the right thing to do? There was a leadership crisis. And so I want to show you three things in the text this morning as we go through Judges 4 and Judges 5. Number one, how do crises of leadership start? There's a catalyst to a crisis. How do they start? Number two, how are they answered? Who does God call to lead when there's a crisis of leadership? And number three, who is ultimately in control? During any leadership crisis, you will have a catalyst, a calling, and then you will ultimately have God enthroned and in control above all of it. And so I want to talk about those three things. During World War II, Europe didn't need a soft, warm, and fuzzy leader. Europe needed a courageous one. And they got one. His name was Winston Churchill. Churchill came on the scene, and he predicted that all this stuff was going to happen before it happened. He saw Hitler for who he was well before he revealed his colors. Churchill came on the scene, and he said stuff like, "You cannot reason with a tiger when your head is in its mouth." He said of his own leaders in Britain and other European leaders, he said each one hopes that if they feed the crocodile enough, the crocodile will eat him last. He had a way with words. Churchill was the courageous leader that all of Europe really needed. In 1940, he wrote for the first time that in the midst of crisis, when the World War II was at its height, Churchill would say that he was resting the best at night because his head was hitting the pillow and he knew that there was a leader who was doing something about what was going on. He finally had peace because of that. One of my favorite definitions of leadership comes from a guy named Hiram Smith, and he says this: leaders conduct planned conflict against the status quo. A leader is anybody who conducts planned conflict against the status quo. And in Judges 4 and Judges 5, you will see two leaders that conduct planned conflict against the status quo. It is two women. And it is an amazing account of leadership. All right, let's jump in here. Talk about a leadership crisis, the catalyst. How do these things start? Look at Judges chapter 4, verse 1. Judges chapter 4, verse 1. The people of Israel, here's your structural key, again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. They sold him to the hand of Jabin, the king of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help. He had 900 chariots of iron, and he oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years. Now, again, verse 1 is the structural key to the book. So when you see, again, Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, you know that the cycle is repeating itself. This is Judges' way of saying that the rebellion is continuing, that the status quo is continuing in Israel because you had no leaders stepping up to do the courageous thing. And Judges will say that every time Israel does evil in the sight of the Lord, it is directly connected with idolatry. It is directly connected with serving other gods. Judges, more than any other book in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, will teach you this. Idolatry and serving other gods leads to slavery. Idolatry and serving and worshiping some things instead of someone, God, will always lead to slavery. And the principle behind this text, even before we dive in too deep, the more you sin in life, the worse the slavery. The more you sin, the worse the slavery. The less conscious you are of your slavery, the more chaos it unleashes in your life. But there's a phrase at the end of verse 1 that's super indicative. And it says something like ESV. It says, after Ehud died. The NIV says something just a minor difference in that translation. If you have the NIV translation, it will say, not after Ehud died at the end of verse 1, but now that Ehud was dead. It's a really small difference, but it makes a huge implication on the text. And what the author of Judges is saying is he's not just saying when this happened in Israel, he's actually saying why this happened in Israel. Turn back to Joshua. I want you to hold your place in Judges 4, and I want you to turn back to Joshua chapter 11. I'm just going to look really, really quick at Joshua 11. And skip down, we'll start in verse 1. These should be very familiar names that we just read in Judges 4. Joshua 11 says, when Jabin, that's the same family name that we read in Judges, when Jabin was king of Hatzor, that's the same place where he ruled in Judges 4. Heard this, he sent Jobab, king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and the king of Akshaph. And he goes on and he lists 3 other kings and their territories. Skip down to verse 4. They came out with all their troops. All these kings came together against Joshua and the Israelites. They came out with all their troops, a great horde in number, like sand that is on the seashore, with many horses and chariots. We read about that in Joshua 4. And all of these kings joined their forces, verse 5, and came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. Iron chariots were a technology that Israel did not have during that day. And unlike what we normally think about chariots in the ancient East were not like tanks that would storm and crush the front lines of the enemy. Chariots were designed for one purpose. They would pursue a fleeing enemy when they were on foot. A chariot would chase them down and ensure that they would not get away. A chariot in warfare at this time is a very intimidating thing. It is a very threatening thing. And iron chariots would guarantee you this, if you were the winning victor with a chariot, that you wouldn't have to fight the same battle against the same people again because they'd be gone. It made sure that the annihilation was totally complete. And so this is what Israel was facing in Joshua 11. Hundreds and generations of years later, this is the same thing that they're facing in Judges chapter 4. Skip down to verse 5, verse 6 of Joshua 11. Don't turn back yet. Verse 6. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time I will give over all of them slain to Israel. You shall hamstring their horses, and you shall burn their chariots with fire." Skip down to verse 11. The account of the battle, and it is summarized in verse 11. It says, "They struck with the sword all who were in it, devoting them to destruction. There was none left that breathed, and he burned," speaking of Joshua, "he burned Hatzor with fire, and he carried out the command of the Lord." Now again, skip back to Judges chapter 4 now. Joshua 11 is written generations before the passage that we're looking at today in Judges 4. The land of Canaan had the same dynasty of kings. The family name is Jabin. It's a dynasty. It's not a specific person. It is same military power. Chariots of iron are in the land. And the same command from God is to do not be afraid. Go and fight them, for I will give them over to you. But there is one huge difference between Joshua 11 and Judges chapter 4. In Judges chapter 4, there is nobody to lead them. And in Joshua chapter 11, they have a courageous leader to do the difficult thing. At the root of the problem in Judges 4 is a failure to lead. And at the root of the failure to lead is a failure to remember. There's a famous quote that goes around, you hear it a lot in education, that people don't need to be taught as much as they need to be reminded. Right? That is extremely true. It's a great thought. People don't need to be taught as much as they need to be reminded. Listen to Judges 3, verse 7. It says, "The people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they forgot the Lord their God." To forget the Lord their God and to forget about who God was and what he had done, not only in Joshua chapter 11, generations ago, but also coming out of Exodus. Do you remember anybody else that has an army with chariots of iron pursuing the Israelites? This is Pharaoh's army. God made that one work just fine with no weapons. Joshua 11, they meet the chariots and they defeat the chariots of iron. Judges chapter 4, all of a sudden you're in the same situation, the same area, and it's chaos all around. To forget the Lord their God is not simply a temporary loss of memory. When you see the word forget associated with sin in the Old Testament, to forget means to ignore God's commands. To forget means to stand in fear of your enemies. To forget means to live timidly and cowardly. To forget means to challenge God. Psalm 106, verse 13. The Israelites forgot God, which was a challenge to God. To forget God was not to know God. And there are very few instances in the Old Testament where forget is used in poetic contexts, and it means something like to wither away, to fall. They forgot Joshua, they forgot the Exodus, and now here we are in Judges chapter 4. What is the catalyst to this leadership crisis? Tim Keller puts it extremely well. At the root of our disobedience is essentially a failure to remember who God is. And any failure to obey is a failure to remember. What was the catalyst to the crisis? Not remembering. Leadership crisis begins by not remembering. You guys are all saying, "Jared, are you kidding me? You're telling me that a nation was enslaved for 20 years because the leaders forgot?" That's exactly what I'm saying. At the root of a crisis of leadership is male leaders who forget about God. And it leads to chaos and destruction. But thankfully, in such instances, such as Judges, God calls a leader. And this leader did not forget. This leader remembered, and she remembered well. Look at verse 4, Judges chapter 4. It begins and it says, "Now Deborah, a prophetess," okay, so a woman prophet in the Old Testament. A woman prophet in the Old Testament. Later on, if you guys want to talk about women prophets, we can do that. I won't save it. Just don't have time for this sermon this morning. Deborah was a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, and she was judging Israel at this time. Deborah was a judge in the book of Judges. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the people of Israel came to her for judgment. Now, this is extremely unique in the book of Judges, because so far, as we see the book of Judges unfold, it will say something like the structural marker is the Israelites did evil in the sight of the Lord. The next structural marker is they cried out to the Lord because of their oppression. And then it will say that God raised up a deliverer. Deborah is completely different. It doesn't say any of that. It says they did evil in the sight of the Lord. We get to verse 4, and it just says, Deborah, a prophetess, was judging Israel at this time. Every other judge is introduced by God raised up a deliverer, not Deborah. Every other judge is a man in the book of Judges, not Deborah. The text even says Deborah was a woman prophetess. Didn't have to say that. We would just say prophetess and we would know that she's a woman. Then it says the wife of Lapidoth. She was judging Israel at that time. She was. There's 4 pronouns that demonstrate that this is a woman. And the narrator is emphasizing this aspect. No one expects a woman to judge Israel. No one expected Deborah. Nobody. Dr. Chisholm says in his commentary, nowhere else before or after this in the book of Judges do we find a woman functioning in this role. The leader that steps up is, number 1, it's the least expected. Skip down to verse 6, at the beginning. She, speaking of Deborah, sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, now, Deborah is the one who sends and summons. She is the one who has the authority over the general Barak in this text. One commentator puts it this way. Let's read the end of verse 6 before this. She says, she sent and she summons him. Verse 6, has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you, go gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 men from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun, and I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon, and his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand. Barak said to her, here's the general to Deborah, if you go with me, I'll go. If you do not go with me, I won't go. One commentator says this, our worst suspicions are confirmed in verse 8. Barak, whose name means lightning bolt, is anything but a firebolt from the sky. In fact, there are 2 judges, there are 2 deliverers in Judges chapter 4 that we're going to read about. Both of them are women. Barak's name means lightning bolt. Deborah's name means honeybee, or sweet honey. Yael, we're going to meet her. She's another woman at the end of this chapter. Her name means little goat. And what do goats produce, Morgan? Goats produce milk. Fort Hays is doing a wonderful job with you guys, all right? Now here you have 2 women who are about to lead Israel. One of them is named after honey, and one of them is named after milk, the land of milk and honey. Then you have a general who's named Lightning Bolt who doesn't want to go into battle without a woman behind him. This is an amazing text of leadership. Notice how Deborah commands Barak. Has not the Lord called you to do this? This wasn't an issue of Deborah's perspective in verse 6. This was an issue of God's calling. But instead of courageously leading, Barak hesitates. If you go with me, then I'll go. Barak's hesitation is an indicator of his heart. Compared to Joshua, who fights in Joshua 11, Barak flounders. Compared to Deborah, who is called, Barak lacks the courage. And therefore, we pick up this text and we read in verse 9. She said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory. For the Lord will sell Sisera, the general of the Canaanites, into the hand of a woman. And then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. What woman do we think he's going to sell Sisera into the hands of? Deborah. Not so fast. Skip down to verse 11. Now, Heber's a male name here. Heber, the Kenite, had separated from the Kenites, the descendants of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tent as far away as the oak of Zananim, which is near Kadesh. Now, this guy, Heber, all of a sudden comes on the scene. We've got another character who enters the story. He is introduced quickly, and then he leaves quickly. We read nothing about Heber until verses and verses down in chapter 4, and he is not a main character in this story at all. So Deborah summons Barak. Get your guys ready. We're going to go fight the 900 chariots of the Canaanites down by the river Kishon. They go. Verses 12 through 14 talk about the battle ensuing against the chariots. In verse 15, there's a summary, and here's what happens. After Deborah says, go and do this, the Lord routed Sisera, the Canaanite general with his 900 chariots, and all his chariots and his army before Barak by the edge of the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot, and he fled away on foot. All right. And I want you to highlight, if you write in your Bible, or if you highlight, he got down from his chariot, and he fled away on foot. That is a key phrase in this text. First of all, it says the Lord routed. Routed in Hebrew is hamam. Oh, very close to Hamas when you look at that in Hebrew. Hamam is specifically, it's a word used for holy war. Okay, so God is the one who is given the ability for this routing, for this victory. But notice this last phrase of the text that I read. Sisera got down from his chariot. All right, the NET, Dallas Seminary's translation, where my Lecrae boys over here. Dallas Seminary, NET, you get NET translation, that's Dallas's translation of the Bible. The NET says not that Sisera got down from his chariot. It says that Sisera jumped off of his chariot. He didn't just walk off it. He jumped off of it, and he got away from it. The iron chariot is Sisera's greatest hope for safety, for security, and for life. And the second principle of this text that we have to come to grips with as leaders, when you look to a created thing instead of the Creator for your greatest sense of security, God will not only take those things away from you, they will crush you in the process. Sisera doesn't just walk away from his security. He runs away from his security. He jumps from it. Why? Because no created thing can bear the weight of the significance and the security that only God can give you. No created thing can bear the weight of your deepest hopes and your deepest desires that only God can give you. And if you don't crush these idols that are in your heart, they are going to crush you. And they are going to let you down at the moment when you think they are going to rescue you. Sisera walking away from his chariot is all of us walking away from our idols in our hearts. Now, the story's not over. Look at verse 17. Sisera fled away on foot, again on foot, to the tent of Yael. Now, Yah, beginning of Yahweh, This is the name for God. It doesn't get much better than Yah. El is the name for God. Yahweh El. This is a strong name that means little goat, but this is great as it appeals to the name and the character of God. Verse 17, she goes to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber, so another woman, the Kenite. For there was peace between Jabin, the king of Hatzor, and the house of Heber, the Kenite, at that time. Verse 18, Jael came out to meet Sisera, and he said to him, "Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me. Do not be afraid." And so Sisera, the general of the army of the Canaanites, turned aside and goes into this woman's tent. And she covered him with a rug. And then he says to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." Jael does one step greater than that. Not just water, she gives milk. Because everybody knows if you want somebody to go to sleep at night, you give them a glass of warm milk. And so she puts him to sleep in the tent. She opened a skin of milk, verse 19, gave him a drink, and covered him. And then he said to her, verse 20, "Stand at the opening of the tent. If any man comes and asks you, 'Is anyone here?' you say, 'No.'" Now listen to how this would sound literally in Hebrew. All right, because there's a word that is repeated twice in this text. It says, "Stand at the doorway of the tent," verse 20. "If any man comes by and asks you, 'Is a man here?' you say, 'Nothing.'" All right, so the Hebrew is emphasizing two things: man and nothing, versus the two women, Deborah and Jael. Look at verse 21. "But Jael, the wife of Heber, took a tent peg, took a hammer in her hand. She went," I'm telling you guys, Judges is probably the most rated R book in the entire Bible. And there are certain stories that we will not read. We will read verse 21. "Then she went softly to him, drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground while he was laying fast asleep from weariness. And I love this, so he died." Thanks, narrator. We appreciate that piece of information. Verse 22. "And behold, Barak was pursuing Sisera, the general of the Israelites, who didn't have the courage he needed. He was pursuing Sisera, the general of the Canaanites. And Jael went out to meet him and said to him, 'Come in, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking.' And so he went into her tent, and there lay Sisera dead with a tent peg in his temple." Younger has a commentary on Judges, and here's what he says. "The ironic juxtaposition of victor, Barak, and the vanquished, Sisera, in the same tent of Jael is significant. And it teaches this: the woman, in effect, has conquered them both. Sisera by depriving his life, Barak by depriving him the honor of the victory. The result is to enhance the impact of the revelation that the Lord's choice fell not merely on a woman, nor even on an Israelite woman prophet, as we were led to expect, but on Jael, the wife of Heber. One Jewish scholar, Sternberg, who is awesome in narrative literature, gets it more bluntly when he says this: Barak, the man, had only a junior partnership in a female enterprise. This is a crisis of leadership. And two women stand up to do what no other man could do. Number 3, the control. Chapter 4 is a historical perspective. This is what happens in time as we read it, as the story unfolds. Chapter 5 is the theological perspective. And chapter 5 is a poem. It's the Song of Deborah. All right, so chapter 4 recalls what man does. Chapter 5 recalls what God does in this story. Look at verse 4 of Judges chapter 5, and we will fly through this chapter real quick. Judges 5, verse 4. Lord, when you went from Seir, when you marched from the regions of Edom, the earth trembled and the heavens dropped. Yes, the clouds dropped water. The mountains quaked before the Lord, even Sinai before the Lord, the God of Israel. Verses 4 and 5 show who the real subject of the real action is in Judges chapter 4. The Lord is the general who leads, not Barak. He went out with an earthquake. He battles with a torrential downpour. Skip down to verse 20 in chapter 5. From heaven, it says, the stars fought. From their courses, they fought against Sisera. The stars were fighting against this general. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, the stars of heaven are depicted as the Lord's assembly. In Judges, the stars are the source of rain. They are the ones that are unleashing a downpour upon Sisera. The battle is not man versus man. This battle of the Canaanites versus Israel is man versus God. Look at verse 21. The torrent of Kishon. This is a river, Kishon. The torrent of Kishon swept them away. The ancient torrent, the torrent Kishon. March on, my soul, march on with might. And here's what this text is depicting. Rains are coming down upon the battle site in Judges chapter 4, and they are coming down from God. The rains not only muddy the ground around the battle site, but they swell the river of Kishon. Now, when you have mud and rain and you've got chariots, you can toss those chariots goodbye because they are not going anywhere. So God sends the rain and he takes away their deepest security and their greatest weapon. Then he comes on the scene and he swells the river. And the Canaanite army had one of two options. They can flee north and they can try to swim with whatever armor that they got on. Or they can go the other direction right at the Israelite army. And they'll just stand there and they are ready for them to take them out. This is a massacre, what you would see in the Bible. Verse 22. The Lord then loud beat the horses' hoofs with the galloping of his steeds. The galloping of whose steeds? This is the horses, this is the steeds, this is the army of God. This is not the infantry and the horses of men. This is the infantry and the horses of God. And the horses and the infantry of God do not sink on the water, they ride on the water. Finally, there's one leader that steps up in this account. Look at verse 24, who is emphasized as the leader of this victory. Verse 24 of chapter 5, most blessed of women be little goat, Jael. The wife of Heber, the Kenite, of tent-dwelling women, she is most blessed. Verse 26, she sent her hand to the tent peg, her right hand to the worker's mallet, and she struck Sisera. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. Between her feet he sank. He fell. He lay still. Between her feet he sank. He fell. And where he sank, there he fell dead. Jael. This is in the Bible. I promise you, I'm reading the biblical text. Jael is depicted here as a warrior in hand-to-hand combat with the general of the enemy's army. And for a warrior, no less for a general, to be defeated by a woman would have been the utter humiliation of anything else. In chapter 4, the story that we read used one verb. It said, Jael drove the tent peg into Sisera. The poem in chapter 5 uses 4 verbs to say the same thing. She struck, she crushed, she shattered, and she pierced. In chapter 4, it simply says Sisera died. In chapter 5, there are 7 words of the death. He sank, he fell, he lay still. He sank, he fell, he sank, he fell. 7 descriptions. The writer is drawing a dramatic scene to its fullest extent. Not only are we getting the death blow, we know which hand was the peg, which hand was the hammer. We know that there was a brutal death blow that went to the head of Sisera. She crushes the head of the enemy. And we're seeing it in slow motion. Do you recall any other Old Testament verse that talks about a death blow to the head in the same context of a woman? Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. The seed of a woman will crush you, will bruise you on the head, you will bruise him on the heel. How about deliverance through piercing? You read anything else in the Bible about pegs and hammers delivering people? Do you know anyone else who will use hammer and nails to bring justice and judgment to the world? Jael is the Christ figure in this story. Deborah is the quintessential judge. She's the quintessential judge in the entire book of Judges because she led with wisdom and with character, not simply with sheer might. Jael is the woman who is the quintessential Christ figure. She delivers the death blow with hammer and nail on the head of the enemy. This is a great, great text of the leaders who step up to do what they know that they have to do. Just one point of application. God's hands are not tied by a crisis of leadership. God's hands are never tied by a crisis of leadership. Howard Hendricks, another DTS guy for you guys, he says the greatest crisis in America is a crisis of leadership. And the greatest crisis of leadership is a crisis of character. Do you know a nation that suffered and suffered through slavery because no leader was willing to step up and fight for the morality of God and the justice of God and the ways of God? Judges 4 is foreshadowing United States of America 2018. Where are all the leaders stepping up? Why have all of our leaders, and if you give me a chance to go to Washington, I'll probably teach this text, right? Because why aren't any of the leaders stepping up to talk about the justice of God and talk about how our nation has completely forgot God? This is what happens. It leads to slavery. You know, the worst things that I've heard about the church in America is that the men go where the women lead. There's a few statistics here. Women outnumber men in every major Christian denomination in the United States of America. The women greatly outnumber the men in every major Christian denomination. Women are 20 to 25% more likely to participate and be involved in a local church on a regular basis than men are. 20 to 25% more likely to get involved in church than men are. One man says that families are 90% more likely to come to church and to stay in a local church if the husband and the father is engaged and actively coming to the church. 90% more if the men would step up. Theologically, just on this text, I'm complementarian in my theology, and that means this. I believe that the role of women complements the role of men in the church. And so I think that God has designed men to function a certain way. He's designed women to function a certain way, just like marriage. God has designed husbands to function a certain way and wives to function a certain way. The one difference between men and women in the church is that you can be an elder in a church if you are the husband of one wife. If you're not the husband of one wife, you're going to have a problem being an elder. All right? Every other role, every other leadership responsibility, God has gifted women just as strongly and just as capably as he has gifted men. And they complement that role in a very clear way. That's kind of a snippet of where I am on that. The other side of the argument is egalitarian, equality. Latin comes from the word for equality. It's really bad terminology to even use that word because the complementarian will say that men and women are equal, absolutely. The other side would say that egalitarian would say that men and women can function in any and every role, not only in the church, but also in the home. And so there's a lot of really great scholars that deal with that. I'm reading a bunch of them right now. Our elders are going through a study about that right now too, to come up with a position on it. But men, here's what I want to leave you with, and this is the last thing. Robert Lewis has a a study called The Quest for Authentic Manhood. And he gives 4 characteristics of a godly man. He says, godly men display these 4 things. Godly men reject passivity, accept responsibility, lead courageously, and expect an eternal reward. Godly men in the home, in the workplace, in the church reject passivity, accept responsibility, lead courageously, and expect the eternal reward from God. Manhood is not first what a man does. Manhood is who a man is. And the first mark of authentic manhood is a pursuit of godliness. Manhood is not first what men do. Manhood is who men are. And at the fabric of our being, men, if we are not marked by a pursuit of godliness, we have failed to exhibit the manhood that God has created us to exhibit. What would you do if you were the general, Barak, taking orders from a woman who had more courage to do what you couldn't do? I've entitled this series, The Divine Sawmill, for a reason. And the quote on this slide, week in after week out, is this: the mills of God may grind slow, but they grind exceedingly fine. All of us are in positions of leadership or submit to leadership. And all of us are going to come upon leaders who don't have the courage to do what leaders are called to do. And when you find yourself in that position, the mills of God are going to grind on you. They're going to take everything away from you until you have nothing but God. And then when you have nothing left, and all you have to hold on to, and all you have to trust is God, then you're the courageous leader that you need to be. Crisis of leadership doesn't tie God's hands. A crisis of leadership is a call for God's leader to step up and do what they're supposed to do. Men, Judges 4 and 5 is a call to step up to courageous leadership. Women, Judges 4 and Judges 5 is a call for you to step up as well. It's for wisdom, for character, for godliness, and to do the courageous thing when nobody else will do it. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you so much for Deborah and Jael, these 2 women, seemingly insignificant in the life of Israel, insignificant leaders, who you raised and who you gave the courage to do what nobody else could do. I pray that as we go from here this morning, that our lives would be marked with the courage of Deborah, with the confidence of Jael, and with the conviction that you have called us all to courageous leadership, to do the difficult thing, not the easy thing. We pray this to you, Father, through the Son and by the Spirit. For you 3 are the one true God, and there is no God besides you. Amen.